Hey guys, tonight we're diving headfirst into a journey back in time, not to a gilded age of knights and chivalry, but to a grittier, much less Instagram-friendly version of history, medieval times. Forget everything you think you know from the movies. We're talking about a world so fundamentally different from your comfy, climate-controlled existence that it might just make you appreciate your memory foam mattress a little more. Imagine stepping out of your perfectly pressurized home, perhaps still half asleep, and suddenly realizing the world around you smells, well, let's just say ripe. You probably wouldn't survive a day in this place without a serious attitude adjustment, and maybe a very strong stomach. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, if you're listening, drop your location and local time in the comments. It's always wild to see where everyone tunes in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You open your eyes, but it's not to the soft glow of your phone or the gentle hum of your refrigerator. No, the first thing that hits you is the damp, earthy smell. A constant companion in your new medieval reality. Your bed is a straw-filled sack, probably shared with a few unwelcome critters, and the air is thick with the aroma of wood smoke, unwashed bodies, and something else you can't quite place. But it's definitely not pleasant. Personal hygiene, as you know, it simply doesn't exist. Forget your morning shower, your carefully chosen organic soap, your fluoride toothpaste. Those are luxuries from a future so distant it might as well be magic. Here, a full bath is a rare, almost ceremonial event, maybe once a month if you're lucky, or if the local lord decrees it. And when we say bath, we're talking about a shared tub, often with multiple family members, or even neighbours, using the same water. You'd probably be last in line, meaning you're soaking in everyone else's grime. Lovely. Mainstream historical fact, bathing was not a daily ritual for most people in medieval Europe. It was often associated with public bathhouses, which, while popular in some periods and regions, gradually fell out of favour in others due to various reasons, including disease outbreaks and moral concerns. So, that invigorating morning rinse, a pipe dream, your daily routine would involve maybe a quick splash of cold water on your face, if you even had access to clean water, which, let's be honest, you probably didn't. The water source for your village well likely doubled as the local laundry, and maybe even the spot where livestock watered. Try not to think about it too much. Now for a quirky tidbit. Some medieval texts suggest that people would rub their teeth with rough cloths or even use a mixture of herbs and ashes to try and clean them. Imagine that first taste of ash in your mouth as you attempt your oral hygiene. Your dentist, bless their modern heart, would have a literal field day with the state of your teeth. You'd probably be sporting a charming collection of cavities and an aroma that could clear a small room. The idea of fresh breath? That's just another one of those futuristic fantasies. You'd simply get used to the prevailing aroma of stale breath, body odour, and whatever questionable meals you managed to scrounge up. Historians still argue whether the decline of public bathhouses in later medieval periods was primarily due to changing social customs, increasing concerns about disease transmission, or simply the economic realities of maintaining such facilities. Either way, for you, it means no hot tubs, no fancy soaps, and certainly no relaxing bubble baths. You'd be perpetually a bit grubby, your hair greasy, and your clothes, well, they'd rarely see a proper wash. Laundry was a Herculean effort, involving beatings, lye, and a whole lot of elbow grease down by the river or stream, and drying, that's just hoping for a sunny day, or enduring the smell of perpetually damp fabric. So, you're not just smelling yourself, you're smelling your unwashed clothes, too. Welcome to the aroma of authentic medieval living. Enjoy your stay. So, you've mastered the art of not showering, but now your stomach is rumbling. A very modern sensation in a decidedly unmodern world. Forget your perfectly portioned, nutritionally balanced meals. Eating in medieval times was less about culinary delight and more about caloric survival. Your diet would be overwhelmingly monotonous and seasonal, dictated entirely by what could be grown locally and what the weather decided to grant. If you're a peasant, which, let's face it, Statistically, you most likely are. Your daily bread truly is your staff of life. And we're not talking about artisanal sourdough here. It's probably a dense, dark loaf made from rye or barley, often mixed with a bit of whatever else was available, maybe some peas or beans. It would be coarse, hard on your teeth, which, as we discussed, are already in rough shape, and surprisingly gritty. As the milling process wasn't exactly state-of-the-art, you'd be lucky if a stray bit of stone didn't end up in your daily dose of carbs. Yum. Mainstream historical fact: cereals, primarily wheat, rye, and barley, formed the cornerstone of the medieval European diet for all social classes. While the rich might enjoy refined white bread, the vast majority subsisted on coarser grains. Meat, for most people, was a rarity, a treat reserved for feast days or after a successful hunt. If you were even allowed to hunt, fish might be more common, especially on religious days of fasting. But again, access depended on your proximity to water sources or your social standing. So, your dreams of a juicy steak or a fresh salmon fillet, keep dreaming. Your protein often came from pulses like peas and beans, or, if you were lucky, a bit of salted pork fat. Now for a quirky tidbit to add flavour to their rather bland meals. Medieval cooks were surprisingly fond of strong, pungent herbs and spices, even if they were expensive. While the poor might just get some wild herbs, the wealthy would splurge on exotic spices like pepper, ginger, and saffron. Not just for taste, but also as a display of wealth. Imagine trying to make that gritty bread palatable with just a handful of wild garlic or some dried nettles. You'd probably find yourself eyeing any edible plant with suspicion, wondering if it would kill you or just give you a rather unpleasant stomachache. And speaking of stomachaches, medieval food hygiene was, shall we say, a work in progress. Food preservation techniques were basic: salting, smoking, drying, meaning that anything fresh needed to be eaten quickly before it spoiled, and if it spoiled, you still might eat it. Waste not, want not. After all, your modern concept of best by dates would be utterly alien, and frankly, hilarious. To a medieval cook, historians still argue whether the widespread use of strong spices by the wealthy was primarily for preservation, to mask the taste of spoiled food, or simply for prestige and flavour. Regardless, you, the commoner, wouldn't have that luxury. Your meals would be simple, often cooked in a single pot over an open fire, meaning everything tasted a bit smoky and, well, of everything else that had been cooked in that pot. Imagine a stew where the main ingredients are root vegetables, a few foraged greens, and whatever grain you have on hand. It's hearty, it fills you up, but it's not exactly inspiring. And don't forget the ale or weak beer. Water was often unsafe to drink, so fermented beverages, even for children, were a common and necessary part of the diet. It might be weak, but at least it was less likely to give you dysentery. Cheers to that. So, your culinary journey through medieval times is less about gourmet dining and more about ingesting enough calories to keep you going for another day of hard labour. You'd likely be perpetually hungry, perpetually a little bit sick from the food, and profoundly bored with the taste of grain. That avocado toast suddenly seems like an unimaginable luxury, doesn't it? With your stomach grudgingly satisfied by another bowl of gritty gruel, a new, more unsettling thought creeps in. What happens if you get sick? Your modern mind, accustomed to pharmacies on every corner and doctors a mere phone call away, but would be utterly unprepared for the realities of medieval medicine. This wasn't about science, it was about guesswork, superstition, and a whole lot of prayer. If you came down with something more serious than a common cold, you'd quickly discover that the prevailing medical theories were, to put it mildly, wildly off base. The concept of germ theory, millennia away, sterilization, a foreign concept. The idea that little invisible creatures could make you ill would sound like a lunatic's ramblings. Instead, illness was often attributed to imbalances of the four humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, or even divine punishment. Mainstream historical fact: bloodletting was a remarkably common medical practice across medieval Europe. Believed to rebalance the humours: feeling feverish, let's drain some blood; feeling weak, Perhaps you have too much blood. It was the go-to remedy for everything from headaches to plague. Imagine a barber surgeon, often the closest thing to a medical professional you'd encounter, pulling out a rusty knife or a set of leeches, ready to cure you. The pain, the risk of infection, the sheer illogicality of it all would be horrifying to your modern sensibilities. You'd probably pass out from sheer terror before they even got started, which, honestly, might be a mercy. Now for a quirky tidbit. Some medieval medical texts prescribed remedies that sound more like a witch's brew than a cure. Want to soothe a toothache? Try a poultice made of crushed herbs, sometimes mixed with ingredients like earthworms or even, yes, crocodile dung. Remember that crocodile dung sunscreen from the ancient Egyptians? Turns out, medieval folks had their own weird applications for exotic animal byproducts. The effectiveness, as you might guess, was highly questionable. You'd be lying there, in pain, with some truly bizarre concoction on your face, wondering if this was really supposed to help, or just make you smell worse than usual, and if the cure didn't work, well, that was just God's will, wasn't it? Historians still argue whether the widespread belief in humoral theory was a hindrance to medical progress, or simply the most logical framework available given the limited understanding of the human body at the time. What is certain is that surgical procedures were brutal, performed without anesthesia, unless a strong drink or a knock to the head counts. And infections were almost a given. Minor cuts could quickly turn deadly, and a broken bone might mean a lifetime of crippling pain. If it healed at all, childbirth was incredibly perilous, and infant mortality rates were tragically high. You'd live in constant fear of illness, knowing that even a simple fever could quickly escalate into a fatal condition with no effective treatment in sight, no antibiotics, no pain relievers, no sterile instruments, just prayers, questionable poultices, and the ever-present threat of bloodletting. Sleep well with that thought. Having narrowly escaped the barber surgeon's rusty blade, you're now acutely aware that even if a medieval doctor, or lack thereof, doesn't get you, something else probably will, because while individual ailments were terrifying, the true terror of medieval life lay in the omnipresent shadow of disease dread. Forget your annual flu shot or the rapid response of modern public health initiatives. In this era, disease wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a relentless, silent killer, lurking in every corner, ready to decimate entire populations with terrifying speed and brutality. The Black Death, for instance, wasn't just a historical event you read about, it was a looming spectre, a memory that permeated society and shaped every aspect of life, even generations after its peak. You'd live with a constant, gnawing anxiety, knowing that a cough, a sneeze, or a strange rash could be the harbinger of unimaginable suffering and swift death. Mainstream historical fact, the Black Death. A series of bubonic plague pandemics that swept through Europe starting in the mid-14th century, wiped out an estimated 30–50% of the continent's population. Imagine that, nearly half the people you know, gone, not just individuals, but entire families, villages, disappearing. It wasn't a matter of if a pandemic would strike, but when the next one would emerge, and when it did, there was no escaping it. Cities, with their dense populations and lack of sanitation, were particularly vulnerable. You'd witness scenes of mass graves, abandoned homes, and a profound sense of despair that would haunt your waking hours and infiltrate your nightmares. The very air you breathed felt heavy with unspoken fear. Now for a quirky tidbit, some medieval remedies for the plague were truly desperate, ranging from carrying sweet-smelling flowers to ward off bad air. The miasma theory, you see, was very popular, too. Believe it or not, placing live chickens on infected buboes to draw out the poison. You might even hear whispers of people trying to swallow powdered emeralds or drink potions made from mercury. It sounds like something out of a bad horror movie. But for them, it was a genuine attempt to survive. You'd probably scoff at the idea, but then, with death knocking at your door, you might find yourself surprisingly open to suggestions, even if they involved poultry. Better a chicken on your arm than a coffin in the ground, right? Or so they hoped. Historians still argue whether the extreme societal changes after the Black Death, such as shifts in labor dynamics and the decline of feudalism, were direct consequences of the immense population loss or the acceleration of pre-existing trends. What's undeniable is the profound psychological impact of living under such a constant threat. Beyond the major plagues, everyday life was also a gauntlet of endemic diseases: dysentery from contaminated water, remember your unwashed hands, smallpox scarring faces, tuberculosis slowly wasting bodies, and countless other infections that, today, are easily treatable. A cut could lead to sepsis, a cold could turn into pneumonia, and a simple stomach bug could send you to an early grave. You'd learn to accept death as an intimate part of life, always just a breath away, a chilling reality that would make you cling to every precious, precarious moment. Sweet dreams, indeed. So, you've somehow survived the daily grimace of medieval hygiene, choked down the questionable gruel, and dodged the barber surgeon's leeches and the plague. Now it's time to get dressed, and your modern sensibilities are about to take another hit. Forget comfortable, breathable fabrics, stretch fit anything, or even the basic concept of layers that actually help regulate your temperature. Medieval fashion was less about personal expression and more about social statement, practicality for the prevailing climate, and, quite frankly, being a bit of a pain. You'd quickly realize that comfort was not a design priority. Mainstream historical fact: clothing in medieval times was primarily made from wool or linen, with silk and furs reserved for the incredibly wealthy. Wool, while warm, was notoriously scratchy and difficult to clean. Linen was lighter, but still prone to wrinkling and absorbing odors. Imagine wearing the same thick, scratchy wool tunic for days on end, through sweat and grime, with no easy way to wash it. Your skin would be perpetually irritated, and the smell, well, we've already covered the general medieval aroma, and your clothes would be a significant contributor. Think about your favorite soft cotton t-shirt or those comfortable sweatpants. Now picture swapping them for a heavy, unyielding tunic and breeches, cinched tight with a rough belt. It sounds fun for a costume party, not for daily life. Now for a quirky tidbit. Sumptuary laws were common in many medieval societies, dictating what colors, fabrics, and even types of adornments people of different social classes were allowed to wear. You, as a peasant, wouldn't be caught dead, or alive, more likely, wearing anything that mimicked the finery of a lord or lady. Imagine trying to sneak a bit of forbidden red fabric into your drab grey or brown ensemble. You'd risk not just a fine, but public shaming or worse, all because your socks were too fancy. It's like a very strict fashion police state where your outfit instantly broadcasts your entire life story and social standing, leaving no room for upwardly mobile sartorial ambition. Your desire for self-expression through clothing would be utterly stifled. Historians still argue whether sumptuary laws were primarily economic measures to protect local industries, moral directives to discourage extravagance, or simply tools to reinforce rigid social hierarchies, regardless of their intent. For you, it means your wardrobe would be incredibly limited and predictable. Women would wear long tunics or gowns, often layered, with head coverings common, especially for married women. Men would wear tunics over breeches or hose. Footwear would be simple leather shoes or boots, often ill-fitting and offering little in the way of cushioning or arch support. Think about walking miles every day in shoes that offer less comfort than a modern-day cardboard box. The sheer effort of moving around in all those layers, combined with the lack of proper ventilation, would make every hot day an absolute misery, and when it rained, that wool would get heavy and stay damp for ages. You'd be constantly either too hot or too cold, itchy, and probably a little bit chafed. That designer jacket suddenly seems like a work of genius, doesn't it? With your perpetually scratchy woolens clinging to your unwashed skin, you now turn your attention to your living arrangements. Forget spacious open-plan concepts, multiple bathrooms, or even basic indoor plumbing. Your home sweet hut is less a sanctuary and more a survival shelter, a testament to the bare necessities. The average medieval dwelling, especially for a peasant, was a far cry from anything you'd consider comfortable, or even particularly private. You'd quickly realize that personal space was a luxury few could afford. And noise, well, that was just the soundtrack to life. Mainstream historical fact: most medieval homes for common folk were single-room structures, often shared with livestock, especially during colder months to utilize their body heat. Imagine waking up to the gentle snuffles of a pig or the lowing of a cow just a few feet from your straw bed. The floor would be packed earth, damp and uneven, and the walls probably wattle and daub, a charming mixture of woven branches and mud. Light would be minimal, perhaps a small, unglazed window shuttered against the elements, or simply the flickering glow of a central hearth. And that hearth, it's where all the cooking happened, filling the entire space with smoke. Your modern lungs, accustomed to filtered air, would be in constant protest. You'd probably spend half your time coughing. Now for a quirky tidbit, some medieval peasant homes didn't even have chimneys in the modern sense. Instead, there might be a simple hole in the roof to let the smoke escape, or it would just filter out through the thatch and cracks in the walls. This meant that the interior of your home was perpetually smoky, coating everything, your lungs included, in a fine layer of soot, your clothes, your hair. Even your teeth would pick up that distinct smoky aroma. Imagine coming home after a long day in the fields, only to step into a room that felt like a permanent campfire. It sounds cozy for 5 minutes. Maybe. But for every single day of your life, not so much. Your eyes would constantly sting, and breathing would feel heavier than usual. Historians still argue whether the high incidence of respiratory ailments in medieval populations was primarily due to these smoky living conditions, the prevalence of airborne diseases, or the generally poor nutritional status. What is undeniable is the lack of creature comforts. No running water meant fetching every drop from a communal well, often shared with half the village and their animals. No sanitation meant a trip to an outdoor privy, or simply a bucket emptied into the street. Remember that delightful aroma from Section 1, heating was solely from that open fire, which also served as your only light source after dark. Privacy was non-existent. You'd share your cramped space with your entire family, and perhaps even relatives or other labourers. The sounds of daily life, arguments, snoring, and general bustling would be constant. That serene, quiet evening at home, curled up with a book and a cup of tea, not a chance. You'd be lucky to get a moment of peace, constantly surrounded by the raw, unfiltered realities of medieval domesticity. And don't even get started on the vermin. Mice, rats, and insects would be unwelcome but constant roommates. You've survived the smoke-filled, communal confines of your medieval hovel, and now the sun is rising, which means it's time to work. And when we say work, we mean toiling in the fields from dawn until dusk. Every single day, with very little respite. Forget your ergonomic desk chair, your air-conditioned office, or even a lunch break that doesn't involve eating dried bread while still bent over. The vast majority of people in medieval times were peasants, and their lives revolved entirely around agriculture, your survival, and the survival of your family and indeed the entire village, depended on the success of the harvest. Mainstream historical fact, the medieval agrarian economy was overwhelmingly based on manual labour, with minimal technological assistance. There were no tractors, no advanced ploughs that did the work for you, and certainly no genetically modified crops yielding bumper harvests. You would be working with rudimentary tools, a wooden plough pulled by oxen if you were lucky enough to have them, or access to them, sickles for harvesting, and your own 2 hands. Imagine spending hours every day, stooped over, sowing seeds in uneven furrows, weeding endlessly, and then, at harvest time, meticulously cutting down grain by hand. Under the relentless sun or in the biting cold, your back would ache in places you didn't know existed, your hands would be calloused and cracked, and your muscles would be in a constant state of fatigue. There were no weekends, no paid holidays, and certainly no concept of overtime. Now for a quirky tidbit, the medieval agricultural calendar was deeply intertwined with religious festivals and saints' days, which sometimes provided brief breaks from the relentless toil, but also dictated the timing of crucial farming activities. For example, specific saints' days might mark the ideal time for planting certain crops or beginning the harvest. It wasn't just about the weather, it was about divine timing. You'd probably find yourself praying for good weather and the right saint to smile upon your crops. And if you happened to miss a day of work for any reason, your Lord would know. There was nowhere to hide. No excuse that would truly suffice for neglecting the fields that fed everyone. Historians still argue whether the feudal system, with its inherent labour obligations, stifled agricultural innovation or provided a stable framework for food production in uncertain times. Regardless, for you, it means your life is dictated by the seasons and the land. Spring meant ploughing and planting, summer meant weeding and tending, autumn meant the crucial harvest, and winter involved repairs, tending to animals, and preparing for the next cycle. Famine was a constant threat. A bad harvest meant hunger, sickness, and potentially starvation for your family. There was no social safety net, no food stamps, no emergency relief. If the crops failed, you starved. The sheer physical exertion, the constant exposure to the elements, and the precariousness of your existence would be an ever-present burden. Your modern concept of hard work would seem like a leisurely stroll in the park compared to the daily grind of medieval agriculture. And you thought your job was tough. Try pulling a plough through muddy fields all day. Every day. That'll put your back-to-office complaints into perspective. So, you've endured the ceaseless toil of the fields, your body aching and your mind dulled by repetition. But what happens when disputes arise, or someone commits a wrong? Forget your detailed legal codes, your presumption of innocence, or your right to a fair trial with a jury of your peers. Welcome to the legal labyrinth of medieval times, where justice was often swift, brutal, and anything but equitable. Your understanding of rights and due process would be utterly shattered. Mainstream historical fact: medieval justice systems were highly localized and often dependent on social status and the whims of the local lord or ruler. There was no universal law code that applied equally to everyone. For a peasant like you, your legal recourse might be through a manorial court, presided over by your lord's steward, where decisions could be arbitrary and heavily biased against you. If you crossed a noble, your chances of a fair hearing plummeted to near zero. Punishments were often public and served as a deterrent, meaning they were designed to be painful and humiliating. Imagine being dragged before a lord and having your fate decided not by evidence, but by rumour, social standing, or even a trial by ordeal. Now for a quirky tidbit. Trial by ordeal was a common practice, particularly in earlier medieval periods, where a person's guilt or innocence was determined by their ability to survive a dangerous physical test, believed to be divinely supervised. For example, you might be forced to hold a hot iron, walk across burning coals, or plunge your hand into boiling water. If your wounds healed cleanly, you were innocent. If they festered, which, given the lack of medical care, was almost guaranteed, you were guilty. Another delightful option was trial by combat, where disputes were settled by single combat between the accuser and accused, or their champions. Imagine having to literally fight for your innocence against a trained fighter, with your life as the stakes. It's like a medieval reality show, only with much higher consequences. Historians still argue whether the decline of trial by ordeal was due to increasing theological opposition, a growing preference for rational inquiry, or simply the realization that it was, perhaps, not the most reliable way to determine guilt. Regardless, for you, it meant justice was a terrifying lottery. Theft, even of a loaf of bread if you were starving, could result in harsh penalties like mutilation, a hand chopped off, an ear severed, or even hanging. Disputing the Lord's will, that's treason, and the punishment would be far worse. There were no prisons as we understand them, designed for rehabilitation. Punishment was about retribution and deterrence. You lived in a world where the law was a blunt instrument, wielded by those in power, and your standing in society often dictated whether you received a semblance of justice or simply experienced the full, brutal force of the system. You'd learn very quickly to keep your head down, obey authority without question, and avoid any situation that might land you in front of the local magistrate. Your modern legal protections, pure fantasy here. You've narrowly avoided the medieval legal system's gruesome brand of justice, but now you need to get from one place to another. Forget smooth asphalt, well-maintained highways, or the luxury of a climate-controlled vehicle. Prepare yourself for the travel trials of medieval times, where every journey was an arduous, perilous, and painfully slow endeavor. Your modern concept of commuting or road trip would be utterly unrecognizable here. Mainstream historical fact: medieval roads were predominantly unpaved, poorly maintained, and often repurposed Roman roads or simple dirt tracks. They were susceptible to the elements, muddy quagmires in the rain, dusty ruts in dry weather, and often teeming with potholes that could snap an axle or trip a horse. Bridges were few and far between, and river crossings could mean dangerous fording or relying on unreliable ferrymen. Imagine attempting to traverse these paths on foot, laden with any meagre possessions you might have, or perhaps in a creaking wooden cart with solid, uncomfortable wheels. A journey of what you'd consider a few hours today could easily take days, or even weeks, transforming a simple trip into an epic endurance test. Now, for a quirky tidbit, highway robbery was not just a plot device in medieval stories, it was a very real and constant threat. Bandits, often disgruntled former soldiers or desperate peasants, lurked in forests and remote areas, ready to relieve travelers of their valuables. Or worse, you'd probably travel in groups if possible, for safety in numbers. But even then, there was no guarantee. Imagine constantly looking over your shoulder, gripping your meagre purse, and hearing every rustle in the trees with a jolt of fear. And it wasn't just bandits. Sometimes local lords or landowners would demand tolls for passage through their territory, adding yet another layer of cost and inconvenience to your journey. Your modern roadside assistance or GPS system would feel like something out of a futuristic dream. Historians still argue whether the limited and poor infrastructure of medieval Europe significantly hampered economic development and cultural exchange, or if localism simply made extensive travel less necessary for the majority of the population. What's undeniable is the sheer physical toll of travel. You'd be exposed to the elements constantly, whether baking under the sun, shivering in the rain, or battling strong winds. Finding safe lodging was another challenge. Inns, if available, were often crowded, unsanitary, and potentially dangerous. Sleeping under the stars was an option, but then you faced the perils of wild animals and the biting cold. A simple journey to the next market town could become an adventure of survival, testing your endurance, your patience, and your luck. Your legs would ache, your feet would be blistered, and every muscle in your body would protest. The smooth, effortless movement you take for granted in your car or on public transport would be an unimaginable luxury. You'd think twice, maybe 3 times, before embarking on any journey that wasn't absolutely essential. After the arduous journey, whether it was to the next village or just across the muddy fields, you now observe the youngest members of medieval society. Forget playdates, structured learning, or even a safe environment designed for youthful exploration. Childhood challenges in medieval times were stark, brief, and incredibly demanding. Your modern understanding of childhood, a protected period of development and innocence, would be brutally shattered. Mainstream historical fact: child mortality rates in medieval Europe were appallingly high, with a significant percentage of children not surviving past their first birthday, and many more dying before reaching adulthood. Diseases, malnutrition, and accidents were constant threats. You'd witness families grappling with the frequent loss of infants, a grim reality that shaped their emotional landscape. Imagine the heartbreak of burying multiple children, a common experience for medieval parents. This constant presence of death meant that childhood was viewed differently. Children were often seen as miniature adults, expected to contribute to the household economy from a very young age. Now, for a quirky tidbit, toys were simple and often handmade, like wooden dolls, carved animals, or spinning tops. There were no brightly coloured plastic gadgets or complex electronic games. Children often entertained themselves with games involving sticks, stones, and their imaginations, or by mimicking the adult activities they observed daily. Imagine trying to explain a video game console to a medieval child whose greatest delight might be a crudely carved wooden horse. Their concept of play was less about structured fun and more about informal learning and physical activity, often intertwining with their early work responsibilities. You'd probably find yourself bewildered by how little they had, yet how much they found to occupy themselves with. Historians still argue whether medieval parents, despite the high mortality rates, experienced grief in the same way modern parents do, or if cultural norms led to a more stoic acceptance of loss. Regardless, for you, it means observing children who grew up fast, By the age of 5 or 6, children were often expected to contribute to household chores, gathering firewood, tending to younger siblings, fetching water, or helping with simple tasks in the fields. As they got older, these responsibilities intensified, preparing them for the full adult workload that awaited them. Formal education was a luxury reserved for the very few, typically noble boys destined for the church or court, or children from wealthy merchant families. The vast majority of children would learn practical skills from their parents, farming, weaving, carpentry, or whatever trade their family pursued. There were no public schools, no curriculum beyond what was passed down through generations, your own educational journey. With years of schooling and specialized subjects, would be an unimaginable privilege to them. Childhood was less a time of carefree innocence and more a period of rigorous apprenticeship for the harsh realities of adult life, ending abruptly when they were deemed ready to fully contribute to the unforgiving economy. So, you've witnessed the brief and arduous childhoods of the medieval era. Now, as you look around, you realize something else profound. Your place in this society is fixed. Forget social mobility, glass ceilings, or the idea that you can pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Welcome to the rigidly stratified world of social status struggles, where your birth determined almost everything about your life, and moving beyond your assigned station was incredibly rare, if not impossible. Your modern aspirations of career advancement and self-reinvention would be laughable here. Mainstream historical fact, medieval European society was largely structured around a feudal system, characterized by a hierarchical division into distinct social orders: the clergy, those who prayed; the nobility, those who fought; and the peasantry, those who worked. You, as a common person dropped into this era, would almost certainly belong to the vast majority, the peasantry. This meant you were tied to the land, obligated to your lord, and your purpose in life was to produce food and provide labor. There was no concept of a middle class in the way you understand it, at least not for most of the period, your daily interactions, your legal rights, or lack thereof. And even the clothes you wore were all dictated by your birthright. Now for a quirky tidbit, while rare, one of the few avenues for social mobility, particularly for commoners, was through the church. Bright young men from humble backgrounds could sometimes rise through the ecclesiastical ranks, gaining education, influence, and even significant power. Imagine leaving your muddy fields behind for a life of scholarly pursuits and religious devotion, a path that might even lead you to advise kings. However, even this path was exceptionally narrow, requiring immense dedication, intelligence, and often a bit of luck or patronage. For women, social advancement was even more restricted, generally tied to marriage alliances, particularly for noble women, or entry into a convent. Your personal ambition, if it didn't align with these narrow pathways, would simply wither and die. Historians still argue whether the feudal system provided necessary stability in a chaotic world, or if it inherently stifled innovation and individual freedom. What is undeniable is the pervasive sense of one's place. You wouldn't just know your place, everyone around you would reinforce it, speaking out of turn to a noble, questioning their authority, or trying to claim rights beyond your station would be met with swift and severe repercussions. Your entire identity would be wrapped up in your role within this hierarchy. There was no networking, no personal branding, and certainly no side hustle that would significantly elevate you from peasant to lord. You were born into your life, and you would die in it, most likely within a few miles of where you were born. The idea of choosing your own destiny, pursuing your passions, or even just moving to a different town for a better opportunity, would be utterly alien. Your sense of self-worth would be inextricably linked to your contribution to the collective, not to individual achievement. You've been confined by your social status, your aspirations curtailed by the rigid medieval hierarchy. But amidst the daily grind of survival and the ever-present threat of disease, there's another, more visceral terror that can erupt at any moment: warfare woes. Forget the clean, distant conflicts portrayed in modern media, or the idea of professional armies fighting on far-off battlefields. In medieval times, war was often localized, brutal, and could sweep through your village without warning, turning your precarious existence into an immediate nightmare. Mainstream historical fact: medieval warfare was characterized by close-quarters combat, often with melee weapons, and sieges were a common, drawn-out tactic. There were no drones, no precision bombs, and certainly no Geneva Conventions. Battles were bloody, chaotic affairs, fought with swords, axes, spears, and bows. If you were a man, you might be conscripted into your lord's levy, forced to fight regardless of your training or desire. Imagine being handed a crude spear and told to stand in a line against an approaching force, knowing that a single blow could mean disfigurement or death. The sounds would be horrifying, the clang of metal, the screams of men, the thud of bodies hitting the ground. The smell would be even worse: blood, sweat, fear, and the stench of burning homes. Now for a quirky tidbit: some medieval siege tactics involved truly gruesome and unsanitary methods, like catapulting diseased animal carcasses or even human corpses over castle walls to spread contagion among the defenders. The idea was to sicken and demoralize the besieged population, forcing them to surrender. Imagine living within a besieged castle, not just battling starvation and thirst, but also the constant threat of plague-infested projectiles raining down on you. It sounds utterly barbaric, because, well, it was. Your modern sensibilities about biological warfare would be utterly shocked by the casual deployment of such horrors. Historians still argue whether the perceived chivalric code among knights significantly reduced the brutality of warfare, or if it was primarily a literary construct that rarely applied to the grim realities faced by common soldiers and civilians. What is undeniable is the constant threat to civilians. Your village, your home, your family could become collateral damage in a feudal dispute, a territorial squabble, or a larger dynastic war. Crops would be burned, livestock slaughtered or stolen, and homes plundered. You might have to flee, becoming a refugee with nothing but the clothes on your back, hoping to find safety in an already crowded and resource-scarce world. There was no clear distinction between combatants and non-combatants in the way modern warfare attempts to define it. Everyone was at risk. The fear of being caught between warring factions, of losing everything you painstakingly built, would be a constant, low-level hum of anxiety beneath the surface of daily life. The roar of a fighter jet or the distant rumble of artillery would be a comfort compared to the sound of an approaching army on horseback. Having navigated the gruesome potential of medieval warfare, you now encounter another omnipresent force shaping daily life: religion. Forget casual Sunday services or a personal spiritual journey. In medieval times, spiritual strife was less about individual choice and more about absolute dogma, pervasive influence, and the constant fear of divine judgment. The Church, specifically the Roman Catholic Church in Western Europe, was not just an institution, it was the very fabric of society, permeating every aspect of existence from birth to death. Your modern skepticism or diverse spiritual beliefs would be completely out of place. Mainstream historical fact: the Church held immense power and authority, not just spiritually but also politically and economically. During the medieval period, it owned vast tracts of land, collected tithes, a tax of 1/10 of your produce or income, and influenced rulers. Life revolved around the liturgical calendar. Feast days, fast days, and Sunday Mass were not optional. You would be expected to attend church regularly, confess your sins, and follow the Church's teachings without question. Imagine living in a world where every action, every thought, was potentially scrutinized through a religious lens, where the fear of eternal damnation was a very real, palpable threat. Breaking a religious rule wasn't just a minor transgression, it could mean excommunication, effectively cutting you off from society and condemning your soul. Now for a quirky tidbit: relics of saints were incredibly important, believed to possess miraculous powers and draw pilgrims from afar. Fragments of bone, pieces of clothing, or even everyday objects associated with a saint were housed in churches and venerated. You might find yourself on a pilgrimage, perhaps to seek a cure for an illness or to atone for a sin, trudging for weeks or months to see a particular relic, hoping for divine intervention. Imagine the fervor, the desperation, and the sheer belief in the power of these objects. And then, consider the occasional fraud, tales of unscrupulous individuals selling fake relics, perhaps a chicken bone passed off as the finger of a saint. Your modern sense of critical inquiry would find itself utterly bewildered by the deep, the unquestioning faith Historians still argue whether the Church's vast wealth and power primarily served to provide social stability and charity, or if it sometimes led to corruption and hindered intellectual inquiry. Regardless, for you, it meant the Church was an inescapable part of your life. It dictated moral conduct, performed ceremonies for every major life event, baptisms, marriages, funerals, and offered the only path to salvation. Confession was mandatory, and priests held significant sway over the spiritual lives of their parishioners. Heresy, any belief contrary to church doctrine, was a grave offence, punishable by severe penalties, including execution. There was no freedom of thought, no room for agnosticism or atheism. Your spiritual journey would be laid out for you, a predetermined path of strict adherence and fervent belief, all driven by a profound, pervasive fear of the afterlife. And in a world filled with disease, famine, and violence, the promise of paradise in the next life was often the only comfort you had. Having been thoroughly immersed in the omnipresent spiritual landscape of medieval life, you now consider another fundamental aspect: how knowledge was acquired and disseminated. Forget your ubiquitous internet access, your comprehensive public libraries, or the idea of universal schooling. Welcome to the world of education's edge, where formal learning was incredibly scarce. Literacy rates were astonishingly low, and knowledge was truly a precious commodity, often guarded and restricted. Your modern thirst for information and easy access to learning resources would find itself profoundly unquenchable here. Mainstream historical fact: formal education in medieval Europe was primarily controlled by the Church, existing largely within monasteries, cathedrals, and later, universities, which emerged primarily for the training of clergy and scholars. The vast majority of the population, particularly peasants like yourself, were illiterate. Learning was typically practical and vocational, passed down orally from parent to child through apprenticeship and daily life. Skills like farming, crafting, or domestic duties. Imagine not being able to read a book, a letter, or even a simple sign. Your world would be limited by what you could hear, see, and remember. Now for a quirky tidbit. Books were incredibly rare and expensive. Hand-copied manuscripts meticulously illuminated by scribes, often monks, in scriptoria. There were no printing presses for most of the medieval period, meaning each book was a singular work of art and immense labour. Imagine the awe of seeing a handwritten book, knowing the sheer effort that went into its creation, and how few people would ever have the chance to even touch one, let alone read it. Libraries, therefore, were tiny collections, often chained to desks to prevent theft. Your concept of popping into a local library and borrowing a book on any subject imaginable would be utterly fantastical. Historians still argue whether the limited literacy rates were a deliberate tool of social control by the elite, or simply a reflection of the economic realities and practical needs of a largely agrarian society. What is undeniable is the profound impact on how information flowed. News travelled by word of mouth, through travellers, or by official proclamation, often slowly and subject to distortion. Scientific inquiry, while present, was often intertwined with theological dogma, and breakthroughs were incremental rather than rapid. There were no online courses, no educational documentaries, no endless streams of data at your fingertips. Your understanding of the world would be shaped by local gossip, the pronouncements of the priest, and the limited experiences of your immediate community. The sheer intellectual hunger you might feel, accustomed to constant learning and exploration, would go largely unsatisfied. You'd have to rely on memory, observation, and the occasional sage advice from an elder, that casual scroll through a news feed or a quick search on a topic that piques your interest. Unimaginable luxuries. Your mind, accustomed to constant stimulation and information, would find itself in a very quiet, very constrained intellectual landscape. You've traversed the medieval landscape, from the perpetual grime to the constant threat of plague, from backbreaking labour to the chilling grip of arbitrary justice, all while wearing scratchy wool and living in a smoky hut. You've seen the swift, brutal realities of warfare, the overwhelming presence of the church, and the scarcity of formal education. Now, as our journey nears its end. One final, profound realization washes over you. The utter, complete, and total absence of modern comforts gone. Every single convenience, every small luxury, every subtle background hum of technology that defines your present life is simply gone. Mainstream historical fact: the medieval period predates the Industrial Revolution by centuries, meaning virtually all goods were handmade. Energy sources were primitive: muscle, wind, water, wood, and communication was almost entirely face-to-face or via slow. Physical messengers: there were no light bulbs. As darkness fell, your world would be plunged into an inky blackness, relieved only by the flicker of a candle or the weak glow of a fire. No electricity means no refrigerators, no ovens beyond a communal one or your hearth, no charging cables, no air conditioning or heating beyond that smoky fire. Imagine the oppressive heat of summer with no fan, no cold drink, no escape from the stifling humidity or the biting cold of winter, huddling together for warmth, your breath misting in the frigid air inside your home. Now for a quirky tidbit: clocks as we know them were incredibly rare, and timekeeping was often done by observing the sun. Church bells, or water clocks, the precise, minute-by-minute scheduling of your modern life would be incomprehensible. You'd wake with the sun, work until dusk, and sleep when darkness truly set in. Imagine trying to make an appointment or coordinate a complex event without a shared, accurate sense of time. Your internal clock, so meticulously trained by alarms and deadlines, would be utterly thrown off. And don't even think about entertainment. No television, no radio, no internet streaming, no music beyond what you or a traveling minstrel could produce. Your evenings would be filled with storytelling, simple games, or just the quiet contemplation of the darkness, perhaps punctuated by the sounds of animals or the distant wind. Historians still argue whether the slower pace of life in the medieval era fostered stronger community bonds and a deeper connection to nature, or if it simply reflected a pervasive struggle for survival that left little room for leisure. What is undeniable is the sensory deprivation. By modern standards, no sound of traffic, no constant hum of electronics, no bright city lights polluting the night sky. The quiet would be profound, the darkness absolute, and the reliance on your immediate surroundings total. Food preparation would be an arduous, daily task from scratch. Clothing was mended until it fell apart. Illness was a constant spectre. Communication across distances was painstakingly slow. Your fingers, so accustomed to gliding across touchscreens, would be rough and calloused from manual labor. Your eyes, used to the glow of screens, would ache from straining in dim light. Your ears, accustomed to constant noise, would be hypersensitive to every rustle and distant cry. Every single aspect of your comfortable, convenient, digitally connected 21st century existence would be stripped away, leaving you with only the raw, unfiltered, incredibly challenging reality of medieval life. It makes you want to hug your smart speaker, doesn't it? The air around you seems to soften, the harsh outlines of medieval life beginning to blur as if seen through a gentle mist. The scent of wood smoke, once so pungent, now fades to a faint, comforting memory. The relentless chill recedes, replaced by a subtle warmth that envelops you like a soft blanket. You can almost feel the calluses on your hands dissolving, your muscles unclenching from centuries of phantom toil. The whispers of an unfamiliar language soften into a calming murmur, unintelligible, yet strangely soothing, like distant waves on a moonlit shore. The anxiety of famine, disease, and arbitrary justice slowly lifts, replaced by a profound sense of safety and relief. Your breath deepens, slowing to a gentle, even rhythm, as if the weight of history has finally been lifted from your chest. The darkness, once so imposing, now feels like a gentle embrace, inviting you to let go of the day's journey, to simply be. Allow the quiet calm to wash over you, letting every lingering detail of the past dissipate into the tranquil void. There's nothing left to fear, nothing left to do, but simply drift. So, our journey through the Middle Ages has come to an end. I hope these stories have given you both enjoyable and thought-provoking moments. If you want to explore more hidden corners of history or have any topics you'd like me to cover, don't hesitate to leave a comment below. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey. Your support is the biggest motivation for me to keep bringing you exciting content. See you in the next story. End of script. Sweet dreams.